So first of all, thanks for your time. Let's start our talk with the results, discussing the results. Several hours ago, several results of exit polls were announced. According to all of them, coalition Georgian Dream is leading party rankings. How could you evaluate the results? Did you expect it?
By the time the election started on Monday, I pretty much expected that if the votes were cast and counted fairly, there would be a Georgian Dream victory. Yes, that doesn't surprise me.
How do you think, what determined the results?
The prison abuse scandal was a serious issue, but it was a serious issue because of the context in which it had occurred. This was a government that had been in power for 8 years or so, and I've always said about this government, they're not all bad, they're not all good. They had done some good things, mostly early in their term, which is not unusual. And there was, in the best case scenario, one would say there was a feeling in the Georgian people that maybe it was time to try something else. One would say that the United National Movement had just kind of run its course. On top of, with an overlay of that there is a sense I got out there that people were just sick of this in a more visceral way than that. Feeling that they were tired of being talked down to by a government, being tired of a government that was kind of manic, bumping from one idea to another, and with the self-righteousness of knowing they were perfectly right and their enemies were always terribly wrong and traitors. And that rhetoric is very tired and very dangerous. And the Georgian people responded to that on election day and said, we want to try a different course. And while I'm hesitant to say that this is a victory for democracy, it is a victory for democracy, that this means Georgia is a democracy, we're not there yet. But it keeps that possibility alive.
To follow your argument about democracy, we've heard that these elections could be the test for the state of Georgian democracy. Do you agree with the idea?
I've never been comfortable with that language for a couple of reasons. Because when we use the word test, tests have consequences, right? If you go to get your driver's license as a test on your driving skill, if you fail, you don't get a driver's license, right? If you pass, you get to drive a car, right? Similarly in school, you test on your biology. If you pass, you... Here, and we've heard this for every election in Georgia, and what we learned until now was that there never was a consequence for failing. The West was saying, if you do this election so poorly that you fail, we're going to give you another test. It didn't make sense. But similarly, there was no sense of what it meant to pass that test. So to some extent, we can say today that certainly the Georgian people demonstrated, in my view, both their willingness and their readiness for democracy. And that's great. And had there been an election that had been free and fair, and the United National Movement would have won, that would have been great too. But that by September 20th was clearly impossible, in my view, in Georgia. Maybe I have the dates wrong, but I think it's around September 20th. But that doesn't mean that Georgia has passed and is now a democracy.
Following elections, you posted on your Facebook page, and I'm citing here, a proud moment for the people of Georgia participating peacefully and with honor and respect despite a very rough environment. What do you mean in rough environment, and what made these elections so special?
Well, this was a rough environment because there was constant noise. Is the country going to fall into conflict? Will there be civil war? We heard a lot about everyone is highly polarized. If everyone's highly polarized, they might go into the voting booth and start punching each other or shooting each other. We had leadership at either party, on both parties. On the one hand, you had a party that deeply believed it was going to win. That was the Georgian Dream. They looked at the numbers, they knew what was going on, and they felt rightly, I believe, and I know I've been criticized for saying this, but I believe rightly that on September 28th, the only way they could have lost, or September 29th going to this election, was through election fraud or some just unforeseen, very dramatic consequence. But you had that party on one hand, and on the other hand, you had a party that deeply believed it had some existential, abstract right to govern Georgia. And that could have led to a clash. What happened was the people of Georgia said, no, we're not going to get pulled into that.
It's early to speak about the final results, and like right now in a couple minutes OSCE will evaluate the process of elections. But from the information you own, how fair and free these elections were? The
election observer world, if you understands very well, and they talk about this all the time, elections aren't just the day of, there's the pre-election, but how does that bear on the observation, right? How does that bear on the final decision? In any case, we're past that point. The election day itself, I don't think was terrible. It could have been. It could have turned that way, but it didn't. What we now have to see is the counting. And will the counting remain consistent with what we're seeing, the trends we're seeing? And if that happens, I think we've had, on balance, not a bad election. As far as what I saw, they really did good work. They took this job seriously. Their statements are at least what I've seen so far, are pretty reasonable. And more importantly, their presence made this election more democratic. So that's something in this system worked, and that's not always the case. Now, of course, there were problems. There's always going to be problems. It's not perfect. But we'll see. My big concern now is, will the counting continue in a fair way?
As the director of National Democratic Institute Georgia, you monitored 2003 elections and following Rose revolutions.
Yes.
What are the similarities between these two elections, or what differentiates them from each other?
The 2003 election, in my view, was largely characterized by chaos. This was, and the chaos with the intention of stealing the election, but it was chaotic nonetheless. This was characterized by kind of strong-arm tactics by the government in the early days. The 2003 election and the Rose Revolution, in my view, could be seen much more as the kind of final end of the Soviet era. Shevardnadze, after all, was a Soviet-era leader. Many people around him were older and dated. It was 10 years ago also, and had been involved during the Soviet era. This was not that. This was an election where a post-Soviet semi-authoritarian regime was pushed out of power through an election. So there's a very different political dynamic.
Going back to the end of the one era and starting the other one, can we say that elections 2012 is the starting point for the new era? And if yes, what era is that?
I think it can be. And I think it can be the era of New Georgia. And as I said before, it's an era where it's a multi-party system, where it's a pluralist system, where people who from the old government don't all get pushed out, where there's more individual, where individual freedom, instead of being a propaganda, becomes a tool, becomes a real thing, where Georgians are treated respectfully by their government. That would be great, and there's certainly reason to think that it's moving in that direction.
If to speak about the public reaction and the role of the civil society, what was the role of the civil society back in 2003, and can we say that we are witnessing more mature and active civil society today?
Civil society organizations played a key role in 2003. Georgia under Shevardnadze was a place where civil society organizations were allowed to prosper, and not prosper financially, but become strong and influential. They were different back then. One thing that's clear now is that that's clear from here is that the international civil society organizations that have presences here played a much smaller role here in this election than they did in 2003. Now, while some of them worked on issues related to election fairness, they were not engaging with the opposition the way we were in 2003 at NDI and at other organizations here. So that's a real difference.
And again, going back to the results of yesterday's election, even though exit polls say Georgian Dream is leading party rankings, yesterday evening President Saakashvili announced that his candidates are leading among majoritarian candidates. How can you explain this? I mean, how possible is that? Well,
how can I explain that? Because he realized if he didn't win a huge majority of single-mandate districts, he would lose the election, so he just picked a number and set it. I mean, he went on television, I think it was around 9:15, I'd have to check, and said, we have 53 single-mandate seats, but there was no, where did you get that number? Do you have precinct? Do you have the data? In which case, in other words, have the votes come in which case everyone should know that. Do you have exit polls? Because it's very hard to poll on that, and very hard to turn around so quickly. And I know I had seen other exit polls that were telling me that the pollsters tell me this, but later in the night I began to see numbers that said it was wrong, that they were wrong. And then they went on television, I guess from this pressure, and there was a spokeswoman on just reading a list of places. Sam Tredia, Dede Plischara, Ozergeti, as if that was proof of anything. And I think that was an assertion of a party that was grasping for straws to stay in power.
If you were to advise first three steps that Georgian Dream, the coalition Georgian Dream, has to make when they're in the parliament, what would those three steps be?
The first step would be begin to pass legislation that demonstrates your concern for the Georgian people who have been in tough economic times for a while, where there is great economic potential in this country in various sectors. Create programs that put Georgians back to work, that build wealth here in Georgia. Second thing I would say is communicate to key Western allies, Europe, the United States, and others, that the basic foreign policy course of Georgia will be the same, that this is a country that seeks to become part of Europe in that sense, and NATO is as part of that. The third thing would be what I mentioned earlier, that this is the new Georgia. This is not a Georgia of revenge, of spying, of watching people, of repressing people. This is a Georgia of freedom, openness, transparency, and working together to make the country stronger and better.